Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a stacked lineup for you today. Robbie, who do we have?
Malik Abdul and Julia Manchester are in for Team Rising, and we're going to discuss former Trump advisor Steve Bannon's surrender to the FBI. And Batya Ungar-Sargon weighs in on the media's discredited reporting on the Steele dossier and the larger implications there. Plus, Brianna Joy Gray breaks down the Kamala Harris drama coming out of the White House and how the administration is responding to all of that.
But first, President Biden signed into law the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill yesterday following weeks of negotiations, which we followed closely here on the show. Biden lauded the accomplishment as, quote, a historic investment in our future that will create good-paying jobs and rebuild our nation's infrastructure, adding that it's an enormous win for the American people. During a press briefing ahead of the ceremony, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki revived an old nickname once used by Obama for Biden, Sheriff Joe.
As our executive order is an indication of, the president is very focused, they call him Sheriff Joe for a reason, on the implementation of this, making sure we keep waste, fraud, and abuse, we prevent waste, fraud, and abuse.
It's maybe an old-timey sheriff.
Do they really call him Sheriff Joe?
That's a very forced nickname.
I mean, Sheriff Joe's kind of taken.
Right. It's a bad thing.
Right. Yeah. It's
Arpaio.
Sheriff Joe is not a good thing at all.
Yeah.
But so now that this has been passed into law, the question moves back to Congress. Will the second piece of this Build Back Better agenda? This was the American Jobs Act, and then there was the American Families Act, and then there's the climate investments. So they've done the American Jobs Act part. The rest are remaining in Congress.
They've done, if you can believe it, the easy part.
They did the easy part, right? A massive bipartisan bill in Washington, the easy part. And so the CBO announced yesterday, you may have seen this, that they promised they will have their analysis of the bill by the end of the day on Friday, which is just classic because the agreement for when they would pass this bill was the week of November 15th. So the CBO's like, week of November 15th, 5 o'clock Friday.
That's how government works,
yes.
In 10 to 15 business days, but that doesn't count weekends, and it's starting with next day, and
They're definitely doing the 15 business days. So that means, I think, Friday night, depending on what the score says, there might have to be some, last minute changes to it, but that means we're likely to see passage of it, Friday night. Then Congress goes out for Thanksgiving recess, because when there's a holiday, they don't take the day off. They take the entire week.
Right.
Sometimes they take the several weeks around it, just to make sure they don't come anywhere near that holiday.
Sometimes I wish they would just take the whole year off. They would never even sit down to pass laws.
You're good. You're good. Right. So then they're going to come back in December, and the Senate will handle the bill. But if let's say they do pass some relatively close version of the Build Back Better, which is now $1.7 trillion. Let's say it comes down to $1.5 trillion. So that will be a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, followed by this 1.2, but it's actually 550 of new spending. That's 2.5
significant
trillion. Add another 1.5 onto there. You're somewhere between 4 and 5 trillion in new investment, new spending in the American economy, which it's like 5 times what the Obama administration was able to get through in its first year out of the great financial crisis. And so it remains to be seen kind of what the political implications of that will be. But if you'd have been told ahead of time, in December, January, that Biden might be able to muscle through, $4 trillion in new spending programs, what would you have said?
In some ways that seems baffling, right? Because the Democrats are much weaker than the Obama coalition was when it first came to power. But in some ways, the Republican resistance to the Democratic agenda is much less economic than it was 10 years ago. Right. It's all about the cultural, social battle, and it is a more ardent opposition in some ways than even 10 years ago. But it's not the Paul Ryan kind of opposition to just spending money. Isn't as powerful on the right as an animating idea anymore. Donald Trump really eroded that, actually, without paying any kind of price in terms of their supporters. In fact, in some ways, they've grown their coalition.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When they were passing that $1.9 trillion rescue plan in February, if you remember, all of the national conversation, particularly emanating from the right, while they were passing this bill, was about Sesame Street. Not about not Sesame Street. Dr. Seuss.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
Dr. Seuss had taken like 3 or 5 of its titles out because there was like a Chinese character in Mulberry Street that they said was offensive to kids, and so.
Which was, by the way, ridiculous.
That was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But Republicans spent a week like freaking out about it, even on like the House floor.
Because the culture battle is there.
While they're passing a $2 trillion bill.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating as our politics are moving on parallel tracks.
Yep.
Like the culture war on the one track, and then the actual politics on the other track.
Absolutely. But an interesting article from Vox I had my eye on shows the breakdown of how federal agencies will actually distribute the money, practically speaking. So it'll go mostly to state governments, which will then decide which projects they would like to fund. So this leaves state and local officials with the power to choose which communities, which projects receive that money, a process that in the past has left some communities with poor infrastructure updates, politically disfavored communities. So it is going to be a political tussle in state after state, in municipality for what gets funded. Then there's some kind of automatic, there's an algorithm type thing that determines how much money you should get based on your community needs for like other projects, and they're going to roll that over too. But it will frustrate people. There will be, this news cycle will go on for the next decade of like, why was this funded but not this?
Right, and this hasn't been done for so long that there are now so many projects in line saying, we need, ours is the most.
But there were complaints
project.
with the COVID money, for example, because that was pretty. You could spend it on this, but not this, but not this. I remember going through stories like that. It's going to be like that times a trillion.
Right. And also, it'll give the Biden administration something to do, even if it loses or when it loses the House and the Senate. It'll still be able to govern in that sense. I think there'll be some frustration among Democrats that they're not as ruthless with the money as Trump would be, because Trump was just quite blatant.
Right.
He'd be like, "Look, you don't want to do this, then you're not a state anymore." Like just just very blunt and directly using the power of the federal government, weaponizing it against his blue state enemies, whereas Democrats just constitutionally don't do that.
You don't think
much.
so?
Not to that.
Maybe not to the
degree.
extent that Donald Trump personally would do it, but there's going to be some.
There's going to be once it gets down to the local level.
Yeah.
Then
the local level.
That's where the real politics
is,
and the developers, and who's powerful and who's not. But like in the American Rescue Plan. They pulled, I forget what priority got starved, but they starved one particular priority to add like $3 billion in rural broadband, which is going overwhelmingly to rural people.
Sure.
And that's just a lot of Democrats are like, they hate you. Why are you doing that? But there's still a remnant of the Democratic Party that feels like it's governing the entire country and hasn't completely given up on rural America, and good for them. And the other argument being, if you can send broadband all across the country, it's great for economic development. A lot of people can work from home then in rural areas, and that economic development could then create voters out there who actually are more willing to support Democrats. So maybe there is some politics in it in the end. Anyway, so Stephen Semler points out on Twitter that Biden only had to cut 3/4 of the bill's funding to get that sacred bipartisan label that no one actually cares about. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg will be overseeing $210 billion in grants, doling out cash to projects across the country, including mega projects like a bridge connecting Kentucky to Ohio. That's one of the main selling points for Mitch McConnell, who voted for the bill and has been pushing for this bridge for many, many years. The Department of Transportation's budget increased from $90 to $140 billion. This gives Buttigieg control of at least 5 or 6 times more money than any transportation secretary before him, which plays into the drama playing out this week in Washington.
Right.
Buttigieg versus Harris.
Yeah, this actually is interesting the more I think about it, because, my default thinking was like, okay, I don't actually think anyone is going to stand in the way of, if we're talking about 2028, realistically. Kamala Harris is going to, no matter how unpopular, whatever the issues are, she's going to have a lot behind her. But you know what? This is something that could create some momentum behind Buttigieg, giving him a more prominent role than the transportation secretary would typically have, right? Mm-hmm. So it is interesting, especially given everything going on this week with her behind-the-scenes dysfunction. And that CNN story about how everybody hates her and doesn't like her behind the scenes, it was linking, it was a lot of anonymous sources. Anonymous sources complain about everybody in the White House all the time. It's the easiest story to create. You could create about literally everyone in the White House, because if you give people total anonymity, they will complain about their bosses and their coworkers and their colleagues pretty much across the board. So I don't know how much to make of it, but certainly she isn't doing the ticket a lot of good right now.
Right, and her people are quite frustrated that she's getting dealt voting rights without Biden coming out to get rid of the filibuster. She gets handed gun rights, which is a loser of an issue for her, and she gets handed the border. Yeah. So 3 extremely difficult issues to deal with. The first would be a good issue if you could get rid of the filibuster, but that's not the hand that she was dealt. Meanwhile, Mayor Pete gets $1 trillion to dole out around the country for popular projects that everybody likes. They're just tearing their hair out. Like, this is just utterly ridiculous. Meanwhile, the progressive wing is like, this is who we've got. This is who we're going to go forward with. Yesterday, we had Matt Karp from Jacobin on to talk about the survey that they had done of composite candidates and which ones are most popular with voters. And the least popular composite that they were able to come up with was somebody who used kind of woke social justice language but had moderate politics. And those are the 2 candidates that they're putting in. But however, that's now. Both of these politicians have been adept at reinventing themselves. Sure. They're no doubt looking through all the different Virginia polling results and other survey data. So maybe Buttigieg uses this infrastructure money to refashion himself as the Midwest, friend of the working person.
He would be well advised to do that, probably, because this is going to give him an opening. Unusual Whales took to Twitter to blast the many members of the House who invested in infrastructure stocks. Some honorable mentions include Mo Brooks, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marie Newman, Josh Gottheimer, and John Yarmuth, to name a few. Investments included power, EV broadband, and more. So that's.
They should not be trading stocks. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense that Congress can get away with that, but they can.
And particularly people who are in close races, like Yarmuth, he's retiring. Go ahead, trade away.
Right.
But Marie Newman, she's up for re-election. They're trying to draw a new district. She's going to have to run against Sean Casten in a Democrat on Democrat primary, probably, depending on how the lines come out. Get a mutual fund. Just get index funds.
Lock it in lock it in a box so
until they ban this, which they ought to, but it's their behavior.
They would have to ban it.
They would have to ban it. Why isn't there a law? Well, because the lawmakers.
Congress loves to police your behavior, not their own.
Yeah, they're fine with it. They can be trusted. Don't worry about them. Anyway, we will tell you what's on our radars up next.